Hello, and welcome to Masters of Paint. I'm your host, Lawrence E. Masters, and tonight we'll take you on a journey of paint and pigment as we delve into the mastercraft of scenic painting. The first thing that we need to do is to discuss the specific vocabulary that we need to understand to discuss this mastercraft.
Pigment, what gives the paint its color. Originally made from organic compounds like vegetables and soils, modern pigment is synthetic. Vehicle, the fluid that carries the pigment. Its main job allows the particular pigment to take on a fluid form so it can be applied to the brush. Most common fluid is vehicle or water. Binder, the glue that sticks the pigment to the surface. Without it, the paint would not adhere. Additives, found in many types of paint depending on the kind. Many outdoor paints contain UV inhibitors. Brush anatomy, bristles and filaments. The type, size, shape of the bristles give it a name and its purpose. A ferrule, the metal band that helps attach the bristles to the handle. Handles, plastic or wood. Wood is better for longevity. Glue, hidden ingredient in the brush is the epoxy that helps hold the brush together.
A true artist is only as great as her tools, and as such, there are a variety of apparatus used in the art of paint.
When it comes to painting, there is a variety of tools that we use. A few of them are as follows. We have a paint key. It is used for opening lids of paint cans. The angled tip makes it easy to get under the ridge without damaging parts of the can. A stir stick is when a paint hasn't been used for a while. The water, or the vehicle, and the color, the pigment, get separated. We use a stir stick to mix them back together. The paint ladle is used quite a bit. We use it to get paint from buckets into smaller tubs to walk around with. We also use the ladles as a measuring system for when we mix paint colors. There are several different styles of paintbrushes used in theater or the professional world. The style we use here most is the lay-in brush. The bristles are soft, and this allows to not leave any stroke marks behind when painting. We also have chip brushes. They are cheap, disposable, and are used for stains. Also, we use them if you cut the bristles, you can make them into grain lines for doing wood. A stipple brush is a circular brush used mostly to blend different colored paints together in a wet blend technique. The difference for this brush is you wouldn't do normal strokes with it, but rather up and down movements to push the paint together. We have our sponge brush, which is used for edging along surfaces and gives a very precise line as they do not have bristles. When it comes to theater, there are several different types of mediums that are used to give a textured look. Two of these are rags and bags. Rags are used to give a textured look that is mixed together, whereas the bag is used to have a more distinct textured look for the colors. Another medium we use is sponges. Here we have a few different types that we use. Seafoam sponges and household sponges are what we use the most. In painting, we use them for wet blending paints, along with giving a wood grain textured look, as they pick up and leave behind paint to look like different grain lines. Although when it comes to wood graining, the tool designed for this is our wood grain tool. It has many different ridges and holes in it that allow the user to represent and show the grain lines well. It is used by pulling along and angling the tool to change where the paint is removed from the wood. Large surfaces can be painted quickly using a paint roller. They pick up paint, hold onto it, and glide across the surface, leaving behind a fine layer of paint. There are several different types of rollers we use for this. Some are nap rollers, and some have textured rollers. Our paint trays are designed to pull paint at the bottom and have a stretch of space to remove excess paint from the roller. Our roller screen serves a similar purpose, except it goes inside of our 5-gallon bucket. We use these quite a bit as it helps preventing the spilling of paint and tends to be a little more efficient. Paint sprayers are used to put a layer of spatter across the surface. We use this in just about every show we do. Can be used in wood graining, creating a sand look, a blended look with multiple colors. These paints for this sprayer are extremely watered down. The last tool we are here to talk about is our rubber mallet. Once we are done painting, we use this tool to put lids on paints we use. It has a soft head and will not dent the can, but also gives plenty of force to make sure the lid is on.
Now that you have familiarized yourself with the techniques and tools of the craft, it is time to delve a little more deeply into the subject of mastercraft painting.
When doing base coats, It's really important to have a nice coat with full coverage. When it comes to using a roller, you want to make sure paint is around the entire roller, so that way when you start, you don't run out quickly. Once you start rolling, you watch for areas and try to blend them the best you can. We like to move the roller in different directions, more like a V shape rather than straight up and down. Base coating with a brush. When you base coat with a brush, try to do hash marks or little X's. That helps give paint a better finish, and it can fill in the spaces that you wouldn't normally get by going with the grain of wood. Using watered down paint. As you find out, most of your techniques use watered down paint. It is great for layering and texturing because it lets you see what's underneath but still giving other colors on top. It does take a lot of practice to get the exact effect you're looking for, and sometimes you add too much water, sometimes we add too little water, but that is what practice is for. Here you can see how the process works. After the water is put in, the mixture is stirred until blended together. Next, the paint and water combination is put into a spray bottle and is ready for the spatter effect. Spattering. Now that the paint is in our spray bottle, we will test the spray. We're going to go to a place on the stage that won't be seen by the audience and see how our lines look. When you're spattering with a spray bottle, you want to do your best to not stand in the same spot. That way, you avoid making patterns. Sometimes the paint comes out on a mist, sometimes it comes out as droplets. All depends on the effect you want. The 3 colors we used on our gray was brown, dark gray, and black. Once the black was done, we decided the brown wasn't prominent enough, so we went back and did another layer. We will be using these boards again for brick. Washing out a paintbrush is an extremely important measure. If not done properly, the paintbrush will then need to be thrown away. At the sink, we feather out the paintbrush to make sure we are working the paint out of the whole brush. We can then use the scraping brush to make sure there's no hidden paint and check again to see if we're done. If we think we are done, we can check the paintbrush by squeezing the bristles together in our hands, and if the water comes out colorful or even slightly murky, we're not done. Clean water means we're all done.
Simply fascinating. Now we move on to wood grain. The organic nature of wood makes it difficult to replicate with nothing other than paint. However, there are techniques that allow us to produce even the most difficult of grains.
Wood graining. First for wood graining, we base coated the floor yellow. Next we draw lines on the floor to represent planks. The planks will then be sectioned off into smaller areas. After that, we add more splattering. If done properly, the splatter will come through the watered down paint that is going on top. Today we are going to show you 3 different methods for wood graining. The first are the tools specifically made for wood graining. We watered down some red and brown, then we will put that on the plank with the paintbrush. And the wood grain tools are pulled through the wet paint, removing some of the paint to create the desired effect. In the end, there will be a pattern that looks like natural wood. The second wood graining tool we are using is a sponge on a stick. The sponge is dipped into the watered down paint and dragged across the floor. The third wood graining tool is a fanned out brush. Just like the sponge, we dip the brush into the watered down paint and also pull it across the floor. Once the paint is dry, it is time for the final coat. We use a watered down brown to go over the red brown that's already on the floor. In this first technique, we brush on the brown and blend it in with a 4-inch brush. This helps make sure the brown isn't fully cover the red or yellow base, so you can still see the grain underneath. For the second and third techniques, the brown step is repeated the same as the red-brown was before. Then, on to drying time. Once it's dry, we will tape out the edges to give a nice clean look. On one side, we taped out a straight line, and the other, we taped out planks as if it's broken out into the plank space. When the black is painted, we remove the tape, and now you can see the two different ways we would finish out our floors.
Onto sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. Not like paint. Paint is smooth and soft. A true master can use techniques to reproduce sand.
The next technique we're making is sand. It's often used in musicals to give the stage floor a texture, but leaving the floor ambiguous enough that can be used in different locations. We'll be achieving this look through spattering. This technique can be used to create a concrete look or to texture the floor. We start with a light brown base coat. We then fill our sprayer with watered down paint. We spatter dark brown, gray, and then black onto the surface, mixing all the colors together with a wet blend. This allows the floor to have a natural looking patterns afterward. Once the paint dries, we check under the light to make sure we have achieved the desired look. The final touch we'll do is we'll fill our sprayer with watered down black and spray along the edges so it fades away into the audience.
Brickwork is necessary for any urban environment. Using three-dimensional bricks or painted bricks, a master of paint can create an optical illusion that replicates reality.
Bricks, bricks, bricks. First, we're going to go over how to paint on a brick. Then, we're going to move on how to make foam bricks. We start with a gray base coat, with a mixture of different color spatters over it. Then, I measure the size of bricks we want. We mark it with a pencil, and start taping out the bricks themselves. Then I take a mixture of black and red, and put them on there and wet blend the colors together using a sponge. The color mixture gives a variation, and the sponge creates a texture on the brick. Now notice that I'm not trying to cover every inch of the brick, but I'm leaving spots where the spatter texture can come through. Now let's move on to foam bricks. Foam bricks are used to give a great 3D effect. To start, we take our styrofoam and we line them up on the table saw and cut them down to size. After the bricks are cut, we go through and texture them, because no brick is the same. Here we are using the rasp tool. It is used to scrape up foam and create a texture. Remember, we want them all to look different. The next step is a base coat. Today we chose to use the color gray. And after the gray, we put a red base coat on top. But with the red base coat, we want to make sure some of the gray can come through. Next comes gluing the bricks to the piece of Luan, spaced out using a spacer. The bottom bricks will be cut to fit the rest of the Luan. A finished wall would look like this.
Man has been building with stone as long as there have been buildings to build. In theater, we've had to recreate everything from river rocks to cinder blocks, granite to marble. Each type of stone requires a different mastery.
Once again, we are starting with a base coat and spattering of different colors. We draw out the stones with a pencil and where we want them to be. Personally, I like them to be random, in different sizes and shapes, as it makes it look more natural. After this is done, I get the colors that I want the stones to be. Today I'm using black, gray, green, and brown. Mixing these colors with water will give each of them different looks. After the stone is done, we'll get over to it, get a sponge, and pull up some of the extra paint, and let the spatter texture come through. Once the stone bases are dry, we went through and added more spatter, this time using a stipple brush. This gives the stones a different depth of texture. The sponge was also used for the texture and to make the stones look more natural and dirty. Remember, this whole process is done with watered down paint and spraying water directly upon the stones. Now, for the highlights and lowlights, or the shadows. We start off shadowing with watered down black, or very dark brown, adding some water to each stone and letting the water move the paint around, sometimes using other wet brushes or rags to move the paint around to get a desired look. We repeat the same step with the white highlight, except we would do this on the opposite side. The final step is to add cracks that would show highlights and shadows. Now let's move on to marbling. For marbling, we start out with a base coat which is dry. Wet blending is our next step. The colors I chose to use here are white and gray. The gray and white are mixed together on top of each other and then are blended with a 4-inch brush. The key is not to overblend. We still want to see each of the 2 different colors coming through. Now for the spattering step. Normally we'd use a sprayer, but for this piece is so small, to achieve the smaller drops, I'm using a watered down paint and a toothbrush. The great part about wet blending is that if you do mess up, for example dropping big clumps of black paint, you can simply blend it back in and wipe it up and move on. Here, I am using the stipple brush to blend in the couple spots and using a squirt bottle of water to wet down the background once again. Then the veining begins. First we draw the vein with black and add a tiny bit of white, next adding water and stippling the vein. The great thing about this little squirt bottle is being able to make the water push the paint in the desired direction. Sometimes we drizzle paint, creating odd patterns and then blend them together, almost completely away from the background. This would give us a different look. After all, a piece of marble is not a consistent in appearance. To add a little flair, gold was then added, and using water to soften the look.
Solid painted walls are the bane of theater. Sometimes we do not require wood or stone. Simple textured walls are sometimes all that's needed to bring a set to life.
As mentioned before, we have different style rollers. One of the styles we use a lot is a textured roller. It's made of sponge material, and when it's used, it leaves behind a unique pattern. When we use it, we make sure never to start in the same location and to try our best to paint in a V pattern. That way, we don't have a consistent pattern. The paint itself is watered down the slightest bit, but not too much, as we want our texture to show up and not become runny and blend together. Once the first coat dries, we can start with our second coat. This would prevent our 2 coats and 2 colors to mix together. Our next technique is with plastic bags. The bags are able to create a texture that has very few discernible patterns. Paint is watered down, and when doing so, you can either wet blend it by putting the first coat and second coat on simultaneously, or you can wait for the first coat to dry, then add the second coat. The technique is different, as you can take that bag and crumple it in different ways, giving you different looks every time you put it on the canvas. You can also use rags when painting. This would also give itself a unique texture. Same as before, we will water down the paint, but unlike our texturing mediums, we'll also be watering down the rag. This allows the finished product to look different everywhere. Using the rag would be done with a wet blend, meaning both the paints you're working with at the same time, and you can grab a piece and place it down in the pattern any way you wish, so when it is done, the whole piece looks very unique. Stenciling can be used in place of wallpaper. It is a painted pattern made of plastic or a paper mold. We start this process by putting pencil marks where we want it to go, then use a square to make sure it will end up going straight up and down. Then we tape it to the surface and use a stippling brush. This is the type of brush that we use to go up and down with the paint rather than make strokes. It allows us to fill in the gaps, but not go under the stencil. Once we finish all the parts of this section, we will then move the stencil over using the built-in printed marks, and continue this across the whole wall.
And thus, we end our journey into the fantastic world of paint. Join us next week, where we take a harrowing expedition into the realm of triple cross blending on Masters of Paint.
Wet paint, wet paint. You know I'm crazy about wet paint.